He's a player that should not be part of the Ghanaian national team. His time should have come.
Ghana, they failed to qualify for AFCON 2025 after drawing 1-1 with Angola. Argentina fall 2-1 to Paraguay. Brazil, they dropped points for the 6th time in 11 CONMEBOL World Cup qualifying matches, 1-1 against Venezuela. And Honduras, they upset Mexico the other night, and now Mexico in trouble in Concacaf Nations League quarterfinal action. Leg 2 coming up, and that's going to be a big one for the Canadians. Guys, Mike, when you look at these results, I mean, there's a number to pick from, but which one really stands out to you?
It's got to be Ghana. And I was going to go, up until that Ghanaian match happened, I was going to go with Paraguay, excuse me, I sound like I'm from Kansas or St. Louis. Paraguay getting the upset over Argentina. Diego Gomez really stole the show from Lionel Messi, and you know, there's something there about Diego Gomez playing for Paraguay, but it's got to be Ghana not qualifying for AFCON, Nige. That is incredible. This is a Ghanaian side that they've been on the slide. They've been in just a really bad way. The last 2 AFCONs, they've been one of the worst teams at AFCON. They're not unified. The federation is in a mess. And when you talk about a dark, dark period for a national team, you talk about a dark, dark chapter for a federation like the Ghanaian Federation, Nigel. This has to be the darkest of them all.
It is the darkest. First time they haven't qualified since 2004. There has to be a clearing of the house process for me, because it's inexcusable. This is Ghana. They produce some of the top talented football players that we've seen. Talk about Michael Essien and right now Kudus. Like, there's so much talent there. And for them not to qualify, it's an absolute embarrassment. It's just that simple.
Is that result more on Ghana's shortcomings or more on the fact that we're just seeing African football as a whole, the level raising?
Lack of direction, shortcomings from Ghana. You know, when you talk about Africa as the continent, the North African sides have always done well. You look about Morocco, Algeria, not as much recently, Egypt, but for me, you know, Ivory Coast, Senegal, they're probably, I would say, the real standard bearers of African football right now. And the smaller nations are starting to even go, small nations like Cape Verde are starting to do well now. But for Ghana, for me, that is an embarrassment, because they are a powerhouse nation of African football, and not to qualify is an absolute embarrassment.
I think it's not heeding the call of a wake-up call. And so they got a massive wake-up call a couple cycles ago in the AFCON Cup of Nations. They play Comoros, and they get knocked out of the AFCON Cup of Nations to a small nation like Comoros. Yeah. So then that should be a massive wake-up call to say, we've got to get some of the old guard out, get younger players who actually give a damn about this national team, who give a damn about the jersey, who have that pride, who want to play, and it's their time to shine. There's still some players, the Jordan Ayew's of the world. Jordan Ayew has been part of that national team. I mean, he's probably older than you.
Wow.
No,
that's
he's not.
saying something.
But he's a player that should not be part of the Ghanaian national team. His time should have come and went, but he's still there. He's still guaranteed caps. That is not going to be good enough. There's good Ghanaian players. It is not his team. It should be built around Mohamed Kudus.
I would just say this, just to put a quick bow on this, until they get a real level of professionalism, because when you speak to most of the African players who play, they moan about the lack of professionalism, lack of organisation. Until that side of it is done and they see that there's a real structure of professionalism and a desire to be successful, we're going to keep seeing the same cycle repeat itself again and again with the majority of African nations.
Lots to figure out, but another big storyline is all the injuries during this international break, and perhaps no team dealing with it more than England, who have 8 players, look at that list, who have withdrawn from the November camp due to injury. Declan Rice on this list, Jack Grealish, Phil Foden, Trent Alexander-Arnold. I mean, some key players with this side, and we're seeing this really around world football right now. One of the big contributing factors that's been pointed to is the increase in fixtures. Mike, when you see this list and what these teams are dealing with, what comes to mind for you?
It's too much football. It's way too much football, but also when you look at this list, I fail to have sympathy for England. There's a bit of jealousy that I have being a fan of another country or being fans of other countries.
What country?
Sierra Leone. I wish we had some of these players, but it's a combination of having too much football matches. It was only a couple months ago that we were just putting a cap on the European Championship. We were just putting a cap on Copa America, the Olympics. Now we have club football. Now we have the Nations League. I mean, we're going to be less than a year away from the FIFA Club World Cup. It's just too much football. And a lot of these players, They're young players. Cole Palmer, he's a young player. Trent Alexander-Arnold, not as young as he used to be. Phil Foden, he's a young, experienced player. So the injuries are going to mount up, and it's not just England that are feeling it. It's the rest of world football. Martin Odegaard, Arsenal's season could be derailed because Martin Odegaard played too much football, gets injured internationally in a match that would have been deemed a friendly before that's deemed a mandatory match. He has to go play. And it's just
I would
not
say,
good.
though, let's be careful, though, because I think when you look at these players, let's look at it on an individual case basis. And I think with the England situation, for me, England have no one to blame but themselves. They don't have a manager in place. Makes no sense to bring Thomas Tuchel in, but he doesn't take over till January. So, of course, these players are going to take advantage of it. You know, you're not the England manager, you're the interim England manager. So their players or clubs might have an influence to say, this isn't that important, stay at home because of how competitive the Premier League is. So for me, I think that plays a part. So I would say some of these players, you've got to look at an individual basis, depending on the club and how many games they're playing. But like Michael said, there is a lot of football. But we're looking at expanded tournaments. You know, from back in years ago, to play in the Champions League, you had to be a champion to play in the Champions League. There was maybe only 3 or 4. Then we saw an expanded Champions League format, and we saw an even more expanded Champions League format. So some of these players are going to play. And when you are a top player or one of the best players, you better believe you're going to play because it's beneficial for the club, for merchandising and sales and people coming to watch the game, but it's also beneficial for UEFA and it's also beneficial for FIFA. They want to see the best players play. So you're going to see them playing more and more games. And you talk about FA Cup in England, you talk about Leagues Cup, you talk about obviously whether the teams are playing in the Champions League, the Europa League, and now the Europa Conference League. So there's so many games that these players are consistently playing. But at the same side, the other argument is squads of 35 or 25 players. Managers can make changes if they want to. You don't have to play those players week in and week out. 5 substitutes now. We went from 3 to 5. So there are opportunities for players to get rest and period in time. But it's all, again, subjective.
Well, how many more matches are we really talking about? What does that increase actually look like? And our incredible research team went and looked to compare some players from different generations who played similar, you know, loads of games with their squads. And so here's a comparison from 3 different time periods. So we've got Zinedine Zidane in the early 2000s, late 90s. We've got Lionel Messi in the 2010s, and then we've got Bruno Fernandes now. So as you can see there in the average matches, the real jump really happens between Zidane's era and Lionel Messi, going from an average of 51.3 matches to 66. And then that is kind of consistent with where we are today, factoring in all those things that you just laid out, Nige, with the expanded competitions, more competitions added on. So it didn't feel like we were talking about this as much in the 2010s, were we?
Well, we weren't, because Lionel Messi, household name. You also have to remember, especially with the Lionel Messi stat, Cristiano Ronaldo also played a lot of games. You would have to pry these players off the pitch. Their longevity, though, is why we didn't talk about that.
So do we not have players today that you have to...
The other thing as well
getting
is,
injured as much
let's be real,
as they are now.
Messi is one of the difficult ones to put there because from when Messi made his debut, everyone knew that Messi was a once-in-a-lifetime footballing talent. So he was always going to have to play. He was at Barcelona, he was going to play. And also in those periods there, you had to go to the stadiums to watch the games. It wasn't as big as it is now with social media playing a part now, where we're seeing a lot more football, a lot more analysts and people and everyone's moaning about this and that, but you had to go there to watch the games. And I feel for me, when you use Messi as an example in that, it's a difficult one because he's always going to play. He always had to play. And he also had to be successful for playing internationally for the Argentina team. Most teams were built around Messi, making him successful. So when I look at it now, I would say like there are more games being played, but I feel that in that generation, it was different.
Yeah, I think the big reason why we talk about it now is because of the injuries. And you look at the big players that have gotten injured, especially young players getting injured, young players who are typically not playing the same games as a Lionel Messi night. Young players now that are playing up to 60 games. Lamine Yamal, if his manager Hansi Flick didn't take precaution in 2 matches this season, he would play every single match for both club and country. The kid's not even old enough to drink a beer in the United States of America. let alone go and do the things that people who are 18 years and older do.
I don't think he's old enough to vote.
Okay, he's old enough to not vote. We can't talk about beer. But this is all about injuries, and you have to protect your young talent. Barcelona are a prime example of this as well, because...
But there's only been more and more resources put into the physical therapy and the training and the treatment that these players get. So why
these players they're human.
Yeah, but
I'm aware of that. I'm just saying, though, surely Lionel Messi and the players in the early 2010s didn't have the same level of care that is now available to these players.
I think it's the injuries that's making it a factor, and obviously how us as the media cover it. But for me, I agree with you, Ali. I think that it's got to be looked again like an individual basis. Some players are just naturally prone to get injured more than others, and then not every club is the same. The way that you go into one club and their sports science and how they treat players is completely to another club, completely different to another club. All of that plays a part in how you train your body, how the clubs has their sports scientists, their nutritionists. It's all different. And then at the end of the day, I've always been someone that I could play all those games without having no problems, not getting injured. I went in my entire career, the worst injury I had was a fractured ankle. So for me, I hate when we try and tarnish everyone with the same brush, but everyone's different. What Messi did is phenomenal, and how he did it and how he stayed fit. But I'm sure that Barcelona played a part, and he stayed able to play now because, again, like you said, it's got even better and improved when it comes to sports science to keep that longevity. Other players will get injured because you're just not genetically built to be as successful as some players.
So I think my only rebuttal to that is the human body can only do so much. And from Lionel Messi playing 60-something games, which we're all saying, wow, Bruno Fernandes playing 70-something games only a few years later, which are saying, oh my gosh, to players, we're getting to a point where players are going to be playing 80 matches in a calendar year.
Yeah, but okay.
Sports science can only take you so far, because look at the top players, Nige. The top players who are getting injured on the regular, not for a couple weeks, but for out an entire season.
Okay, but we say that, but when you look at the most of these players, there's players' names, unfortunately. Rodri was another one who played a tremendous amount of games until he got injured recently. Kyle Walker's a player that's played a lot of games as well. He wasn't on the list, but Kyle Walker's played pretty much the same amount of games as Bruno Fernandes, and maybe even more for Manchester City in England. He's not injured, but what's Pep Guardiola done? Sat him on the bench and put Rico Lewis and used other players. So we're only concentrating, and it's becoming a big deal because we're concentrating on the players who are getting injured. There are a number of players who have played just as many games who don't get a mention because they're not injured, because they stayed fit.
I think one thing we can all agree on is that we are seeing more star players, more key figures within their squads dealing with some pretty significant season-ending injuries. And important note, too, that on some of those injuries, non-contact was the culprit in that. And so just all around an interesting conversation, and one that we will continue to have here on the Golazo Network and all of our platforms, as fixture congestion is a real thing and the injuries certainly are as well.